There comes a moment in every life, often not marked by trumpets or the hand of fate, when a person grows weary of begging for what should have been freely given. A moment when the heart, battered by rejection or neglect, whispers a final plea, no more. And in that whisper begins the birth of something far more powerful than any external affection, the awakening of the self. Today we explore what happens when we stop begging for love, not as a strategy of pride, but as an act of psychic survival. This isn't about isolation, nor about cynicism, but about returning to the source, your own soul. When you stop begging for love, something profound begins to happen. Not in the outer world first, but deep within. The carefully constructed mask you've worn, the one built over years of seeking approval and affection, begins to loosen and fall away. This mask or persona was designed to make you likable, acceptable, even lovable. It served its purpose in society, in friendships, in relationships, in family systems. But underneath it all, a subtle deception was taking place. You became so identified with a version of yourself that pleased others that you lost touch with who you truly were. And so, when the desperation for love ends, not out of bitterness, but from an exhausted truth, the persona starts to disappear. At first, this feels disorienting. Without a familiar roles to cling to, the caretaker, the charmer, the compliant one, you may feel like a blank slate, uncertain and raw. You may ask, if I am not this person who bends to fit, then who am I? The answer does not come immediately because it has been buried under layers of performance and survival. But as the outer shell cracks, the true self, the one who was exiled for being too much, too needy, too angry, too wild, begins to stir, not as a rebellion, but as a resurrection. This emergence is often painful. You may grieve for the years spent pretending, for the love that never came, for the self you abandoned in order to be accepted. But this grief is sacred. It is the price of authenticity. The world you once knew may not welcome this truer version of you because it has grown accustomed to your false self. Some will resist your change. Some may leave and you will be tempted to return to your mask. But if you can withstand the discomfort, something miraculous happens. You begin to hear your own voice again, faint at first, but unmistakable. You start to make decisions not based on pleasing others, but based on your own inner compass. You find that solitude, once unbearable, now offers space for reflection and clarity. You realize that being loved for a false self is far lonelier than being alone with your truth. And so, the self, your real inner self, begins to solidify. It's not perfect nor polished, but it is whole. In this unfolding, you reclaim your power. You no longer wait to be chosen because you have chosen yourself. You no longer need to manipulate or control how others see you because your sense of worth is no longer tethered to their gaze. And perhaps most surprisingly, you begin to experience a peace that is not dependent on external affection. This peace comes from alignment, from living as who you are, not who you think you must be. And that in itself is the beginning of true love, not the kind that begs, but the kind that becomes. When you stop begging for love, something long buried begins to surface. The parts of yourself that you hid away in order to be accepted. These parts often misunderstood and rejected in childhood or early relationships were labeled as unworthy. Your anger, your neediness, your intensity, your desire to be seen without filters. To secure love, you silenced them. You crafted a version of yourself that was easy to love, agreeable, adaptable, emotionally tidy, but the cost of this compromise was the fragmentation of your soul. The parts you buried did not disappear. They retreated into the unconscious, waiting for the day you would be strong enough to face them. That day comes when you stop performing for affection, when the need to be loved no longer outweighs the need to be whole. The shadow stirs. This shadow is not evil. It is not something to be feared or destroyed. It is made of the very qualities you disowned in order to survive. And it comes not as punishment, but as invitation. As the invitation is to look directly at what you once found unacceptable in yourself and to ask, why was this hidden? Who told me this could not be loved? At first, this confrontation can be unsettling. The shadow does not speak in a polite language of society. It is raw. It may present itself as rage, as shame, as a flood of unmet longing. But behind this chaos lies vitality. The energy of the shadow is the energy of your authenticity, trapped in a prison of self-rejection. To integrate it is not to unleash destruction, but to restore balance. You begin to see that your so-called flaws were often just misread strengths. What looked like neediness was a deep capacity for intimacy. What appeared as anger was a cry for boundaries. What you thought was weakness was sensitivity, the root of empathy, creativity, and emotional depth. The process of integration is not instant. It is a gradual act of reparenting, sitting with the parts of yourself that you once dismissed, holding them with compassion and allowing them to take their rightful place within you. As this happens, your sense of self expands. You are no longer split between the acceptable and unacceptable selves. You are one, complex, whole, and real. The energy that once went into suppressing your shadow now becomes available to you. You begin to act from depth, not from performance. And most importantly, you no longer approach love as someone in hiding. You do not beg because you have nothing left to conceal. Your love becomes honest. You can say, "Here I am, all of me. I do not demand that you love me, only that I remain true to myself, whether you stay or go." In that space of radical self-acceptance, your shadow becomes not a curse, but a guide. It no longer haunts you from the dark. It walks beside you, integrated, seen, and finally home. When you stop begging for love, a subtle but powerful withdrawal begins to take place within your psyche. The need for external validation, the approval, affection, and attention you once craved, begins to dissolve. This is not a gentle unraveling. It feels, at first, like a kind of dying. The old self, the one who was fed by crumbs of affection, begins to starve. You may feel empty, exposed, and unsure of how to sustain yourself emotionally. What once filled you, a smile, a text, a compliment, even a toxic connection, now holds no nourishment, and so you are forced inward. This inward turning is not escape, but alchemy. At the core of this shift is emotional transmutation. Like a raw substance placed into the heat of a crucible, you begin to transform under pressure. The longing for love, once directed outward, now becomes an inner fire. It lights up the corridors of your own soul, revealing the places you have neglected. You start to feel emotions you once numbed: grief, fear, loneliness. These emotions are not obstacles. They are materials for inner work. Every tear, every ache, every night of silence becomes a sacred ingredient in your psychological rebirth. In this process, you learn the art of sitting with yourself, not as a punishment, but as a reclamation. You begin to notice how much of your life was spent in pursuit of someone else's attention, how your self-worth rose and fell with the tides of others' approval. Without that external supply, you're left with only yourself. But that is the hidden gift. It is in this solitude that the most essential discovery is made, that your value does not originate from being loved by others, but from being in alignment with your own essence. You begin to feed yourself with new sustenance, inner truths, personal rituals, creative expression, spiritual connection. The nervous system, once hooked on external dopamine, slowly rewires. You develop emotional sobriety. You realize that you can survive without the validation you once believed you needed to live. And more than survive, you begin to thrive. There is clarity in your thoughts. There is stability in your emotions. There is a quiet confidence that grows not from being admired, but from being rooted in something eternal within. This inner alchemy, though invisible, changes everything. You no longer offer yourself on the altar of relationships. You do not negotiate your dignity for closeness. You do not compromise your integrity for the illusion of connection. You love from fullness, not from lack. You give because your cup is full, not because it is empty. And perhaps most importantly, you become whole. Not perfect, not invulnerable, but whole. You carry your wounds with awareness, your strengths with humility, and your presence with calm. The love you once begged for becomes the light that now radiates from within you. And in that light, your transformation is complete. You are no longer waiting to be chosen. You have chosen yourself, and that is the gold born from the fire. When you stop begging for love, your eyes begin to open, not just to others, but to yourself. You begin to realize how much of your emotional energy was spent chasing illusions, not people. For years, perhaps, you weren't falling in love with who someone truly was. You were falling in love with the projection of your unmet needs. The savior, the caretaker, the ideal partner. These were all fantasies your wounded inner world cast onto others, hoping they would finally rescue you from the pain you didn't know how to face on your own. Without realizing it, you shaped others into roles that matched your internal dramas. You ignored the red flags because the story was too beautiful to interrupt. You tolerated neglect because you thought love was something to be earned. You mistook intensity for connection, inconsistency for mystery, and anxiety for passion. All of it was driven by projection, the unconscious process of seeing not what is, but what you long for. When you were begging for love, you weren't relating to people as they were, you were relating to your own unhealed story, superimposed on someone else's face. But the moment you stop begging, the spell breaks. What once felt magnetic begins to lose its power. You start to see clearly. The people who once had control over your emotional state now appear in a different light, not as magical beings or potential soulmates, but as flawed individuals, some of whom were simply not capable of meeting you with the depth you deserve. And instead of collapsing from that realization, you find strength in it. You no longer need the projection. You are ready for truth. This clarity changes your entire approach to relationships. You become less reactive and more discerning. You begin to pause before attaching, questioning not only who they are, but why you're drawn to them. You ask, is this connection rooted in reality or in an old wound? That one question saves you years of pain. It allows you to make choices not from desperation, but from awareness. You stop needing to prove your worth to someone who cannot see you. You stop hoping that someone will change just because you love them enough. And in this detachment, a new kind of freedom emerges. Not the cold freedom of isolation, but the warm freedom of self-possession. You no longer fall for appearances. You are drawn instead to presence, to depth, to emotional honesty. Most beautifully, as you release your projections, you give others the gift of being seen for who they truly are, not what you wish them to be. And you begin to allow yourself the same grace. You relate human to human, soul to soul, not savior to victim or parent to child. This is the beginning of real intimacy, born not from fantasy, but from presence. In seeing others clearly, you finally see yourself. And in that vision, love becomes something you no longer beg for. It becomes something you choose. With eyes wide open, when you stop begging for love, an unfamiliar silence begins to surround you. It is not just the silence of unanswered messages or the absence of affection. It is deeper, more existential. The noise that once filled your days, the inner chatter of insecurity, the frantic effort to be seen, the constant reaching for someone else's attention begins to quiet. What remains is a stillness that feels at first like emptiness. And because you were once addicted to the noise of connection, that emptiness can feel unbearable. But if you resist the urge to fill it with distractions, with new relationships, with old patterns, you begin to realize the silence is not your enemy. It is your teacher. It is a space where your soul can finally breathe without the pull of external love to define you. You are left with the unfiltered presence of your own being. And in that raw presence, a sacred intimacy begins, not with another, but with yourself. At first, this silence reveals discomforts you've long suppressed. Memories rise. Emotions you've avoided come to the surface. The quiet becomes a mirror, reflecting everything you tried to outrun through connection. You may find grief that was never processed, anger that was never expressed, needs that were never acknowledged. It can feel overwhelming, even frightening, but in truth, this is healing. The silence is not harming you. It is holding space for what has always needed to be heard. As you stay with it, the silence transforms. What once felt like isolation begins to feel like solitude. You realize how often you sought companionship just to avoid meeting yourself. But now, in the sanctuary of quiet, you begin to listen to your inner voice, not the voice of fear or longing, but the voice of truth. You start to know your own rhythms, your real desires, your authentic values. The noise of needing to be chosen fades. In its place grows a steady confidence. I am here. I am enough. I am whole. This kind of inner listening becomes a form of spiritual practice. You may start to notice your dreams more vividly, your intuitions more clearly. The unconscious begins to speak, not in demands, but in symbols, metaphors. The silence becomes a portal into a deeper relationship with your psyche, your inner wisdom. And as you learn to trust it, you no longer fear being alone. You may even come to cherish it. There is a kind of love that arises in this space, a love not directed outward, but inward. It is not inflated or narcissistic. It is a calm, quiet reverence for your own existence. In this sacred silence, you stop begging for love because you have found its source within. Not a performance, not a transaction, but a presence. And once you've touched that inner ground, you'll never again settle for noise disguised as affection. You will seek only what resonates with the stillness you've come to know as home. When you stop begging for love, a paradox begins to unfold. At first, it seems as though the world has grown colder, quieter, as if love itself has become scarce. You may feel temporarily invisible, as if no one sees you now that you've stopped performing for attention or stretching yourself thin to be accepted. But what's actually happening is that the noise has cleared, the false attachments begin to fall away, and in that space, something remarkable occurs. Love begins to move toward you, slowly, steadily, and without demand, because you are no longer chasing it from emptiness. But this is not the same kind of love you once knew. It is not built on urgency, fear of abandonment, or the desperate hope to be rescued. It is not rooted in the roles you used to play. It doesn't arrive in the form of someone completing you, because now you are already whole. What appears instead is resonance, connections that mirror the inner work you've done, people who meet you at your level of self-awareness and emotional honesty. These relationships feel different, calmer, clearer, more grounded. They don't flood you with dopamine and anxiety. They offer you peace. This is the quiet reward of self-possession. You are no longer looking for someone to save you from yourself. You have faced your shadow, embraced your solitude, and learned to stand on the solid ground of your own truth. And from that place, you attract not based on lack, but on presence. Love begins to come not as a prize for performing, but as a reflection of the alignment within you. You no longer have to prove your worth, you simply are, and that is enough. Ironically, by no longer needing love to fill the void, you become more lovable. Not because you've become more agreeable or charming, but because you radiate a rare kind of stability, the kind that only comes from someone who knows who they are. You set boundaries with grace. You love without attachment. You remain open but not porous. And in your presence, others feel safe, not manipulated, not pursued, not idealized, but genuinely seen. This kind of love, authentic, grounded, mutual, was never possible when you were begging for it. When love was a survival mechanism, you attracted relationships that echoed your inner wounds. But now that love is a choice, not a need, you begin to experience a higher form of connection. You recognize it not by intensity, but by ease, not by drama, but by depth. And you realize that the love you once chased in others was only ever a mirror of what you needed to find within yourself. You are no longer waiting to be loved, you are already in love. With your truth, your path, your presence. And from that sacred foundation, everything else becomes a reflection, not a replacement. Love no longer completes you, it simply meets you